Welcome back to the channel. For over 50 years, the Victors have controlled the Rolling Stones narrative. Today we return to the beginning, to the man who started it all. He was the founder, the leader, the soul. But to his friends, Brian Jones became an obstacle. They didn't just fire him, they erased him. They stole the band he named, they seduced the woman he loved, and they left him to rot in Sussex. And when he was found motionless in his pool just weeks later, the silence was deafening. Did the architect of the Rolling Stones slip, or was he pushed by the weight of the betrayal? Brian Jones was born in post-war Cheltenham. Growing up in a strict middle-class environment, he soon showed signs of rebellion against social norms. The son of a strict aeronautical engineer and a piano teacher, Brian was an anomaly, physically frail, asthmatic, but possessing a terrifying IQ of 135. He weaponized his intelligence against the mediocrity of his middle-class upbringing, finding two ways to assert dominance over a world he despised: music and sexual conquest. But this need for validation left a trail of biological wreckage long before he was famous. He scattered his DNA across England like cigarette ash, fathering illegitimate children with a carelessness that bordered on the sociopathic. By the age of 17, he had already impregnated his girlfriend, a 14-year-old schoolgirl, and erased her from his existence without a shred of empathy, forcing her to bear the burden of his actions in total isolation. Before turning 20, he had abandoned 2 more children with different women, leaving a wake of fatherless infants behind him. He didn't offer them a family. He offered them silence. When cornered, he signed checks to make them disappear, viewing these payments not as an act of contrition, but as a necessary business cost to purchase his own freedom. To Brian, his own flesh and blood were merely inconvenient byproducts of a night's pleasure. This was not youthful irresponsibility. It was the establishment of a narcissistic pattern. He wanted the glory of the conquest, but refused to pay the price of the aftermath, a fatal flaw that would eventually bleed into the very foundation of the Rolling Stones. While he was sowing chaos in his personal life, he was finding order in music. Music was the only language that made sense to his engineer's brain. Jones displayed a remarkable aptitude for music. He could reportedly master the mechanics of a new instrument within hours. He could pick up a saxophone, a clarinet, or a guitar, and within hours, he would understand the mechanics of the sound. He didn't just learn to play, he learned to dissect. But it wasn't the polite classical music of his mother that called to him. It was the sound of the American South. It was jazz, and then, more powerfully, the blues. The blues was the antithesis of Cheltenham. It was raw, it was dirty, it was sexual, and it was undeniably black. For a middle-class teenager in Cheltenham, embracing American blues was a significant act of cultural rebellion. It was the ultimate rebellion. Brian became obsessed with the slide guitar. He listened to the records of Elmore James until the vinyl turned gray, trying to decode the secret of that weeping, wailing sound. He fashioned a slide out of a lipstick tube stolen from a girlfriend, forcing the metal against the strings until his fingers bled, determined to replicate the sound of the Mississippi Delta in his cold English bedroom. This was not a hobby. It was an identity construction. Brian Jones was systematically deleting Louis Brian Hopkins Jones, the asthmatic boy from Cheltenham, and replacing him with Elmo Lewis, a bluesman with a dark past and a dangerous future. He realized that mastering this music was his ticket out of obscurity. He didn't just want to join the elite, he wanted to define it. The escape from Cheltenham was inevitable. He drifted to London, the gravitational center of the emerging counterculture. The London of the early 1960s was not yet swinging London. It was a city of soot, bomb sites, and damp basements. Brian moved into a squalid flat in Edith Grove, Chelsea. It was a place of legendary filth, a crusty apartment where fungi grew on the walls, and the smell of unwashed bodies and stale tobacco hung in the air. This was the crucible. It was here that he would forge the weapon that would conquer the world. But he needed soldiers. He needed a band. Brian Jones did not join a band. He recruited employees. He was the first. He was the visionary. He frequented the Ealing Jazz Club, watching Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated, scouting for talent with the cold eye of a casting director. He saw a lanky, awkward economics student named Mick Jagger, who sang with an unusual, Americanized inflection. He saw a scruffy, shy guitarist named Keith Richards, who played with a rough, rhythmic intensity. Brian did not view them as equals. He viewed them as raw materials. He saw that Jagger had charisma that could be molded, and Richards had a grit that could be utilized. He invited them to join his band. Living in squalid conditions at the Edith Grove apartment, the complex dynamic between the band members began to take shape. Brian Jones was the undisputed alpha. He was the one with the musical knowledge. He taught Keith Richards open G tuning. He taught Mick Jagger how to play the harmonica, instructing him on how to bend the notes to sound like the blues harpists of Chicago. He was the teacher. They were the students. He named the band the Rolling Stones during a phone call to Jazz News, panic-picking the name from the spine of a Muddy Waters LP lying on the floor. It was his name. It was his concept. Crucially, he established the financial hierarchy. In a move that displayed his deep-seated need for superiority, Brian negotiated a deal with the club owners and their early manager where he received £5 a week more than the other members. He justified this to the others as a management fee for booking the gigs, handling the logistics, and putting the advertisements in the papers. It was a pittance, really, but the symbolism was enormous. By taking that extra £5, he drew a line in the sand. He was the boss. They were the hired hands. Mick and Keith accepted it initially because they were young, hungry, and Brian was the one with the vision. The extra £5 created immediate friction. It became a point of contention, fostering early resentment, particularly from Mick Jagger, a man who studied economics and understood the value of labor. Jagger watched Brian play the leader, noted the arrogance, and quietly began to calculate the true value of the band's assets. The early performances of the Rolling Stones were driven entirely by Brian's energy. On stage, he was electric. He didn't just stand there, he prowled. With his blonde page boy bob shocking for 1963, he looked androgynous, dangerous, and completely alien to mainstream Britain. He played the slide guitar with a vicious precision that mesmerized audiences in the crawl spaces of Richmond and Soho. He was the focal point. The girls screamed for Brian. The photographers aimed their lenses at Brian. Mick Jagger was just the singer, moving awkwardly, trying to find his footing. Brian was the star, and he loved it. He soaked up the adulation as if it were the oxygen he had been denied as an asthmatic child. It validated his cruelty, his abandonment of his children, his rejection of his parents. It proved he was right, but the industry he tried to conquer contained a fatal flaw regarding his specific talents. In May 1963, the band met Andrew Loog Oldham. Oldham was a 19-year-old hustler, a former PR man for the Beatles who possessed a genius for marketing and an utter lack of moral scruples. Oldham looked at the Rolling Stones and saw something that Brian did not. Brian saw a blues band that would play the music of Black America to white audiences. Oldham saw a pop phenomenon that could rival the Beatles by being their dark mirror image. Oldham saw the money. And he saw the problem. The problem was Brian Jones. Oldham recognized immediately that Brian was the musical leader, but he also saw that Brian was volatile, unmanageable, and fundamentally a purist. Oldham needed a songwriting team. He knew that publishing royalties were the real goldmine of the music business, not the performance fees. You couldn't get rich playing I Just Want to Make Love to You by Muddy Waters forever. You needed to write your own hits. Oldham looked at the band and made a calculation. Brian was too distracted, too arrogant, and too obsessed with the authenticity of the blues to be a pop songwriter. Mick and Keith, however, were malleable. They were close friends, they shared a bond that excluded Brian, and they were hungry for success on any terms. Oldham began to systematically shift the center of gravity. He marginalized Brian. He encouraged Mick to step forward as the frontman. He pushed Keith to the front of the stage. He started the process of the coup. The most famous story of this era is the kitchen incident. Oldham literally locked Mick Jagger and Keith Richards in a kitchen and told them they couldn't come out until they had written a song. It was a crude, brutal tactic, but it worked. They emerged with As Tears Go By. It wasn't a great rock song, but it was their song. It was a proprietary product. In that moment, Brian Jones became obsolete. He didn't know it yet. He was still the one getting the most fan mail. He was still the one the girls wanted to sleep with. But the economic engine of the band had just been transferred from his slide guitar to the Jagger-Richards songwriting partnership. Brian, the architect, had forgotten to secure the deed to the land. He was still playing the blues, thinking that was the mission. He didn't realize the mission had changed. The mission was now commerce. The psychological toll of this shift began to manifest almost immediately. Brian felt the ground slipping away. He couldn't articulate it. He wasn't a songwriter, so he couldn't fight them on that battlefield. So he fought them with psychological warfare. He became difficult. He would disappear for days. He would refuse to play certain songs. He used his position as the musical genius of the group to belittle their attempts at songwriting. He would sneer at their pop melodies, calling them sellouts, betrayers of the blues. It was the lash of a dying king. He was trying to assert authority that he no longer possessed. To cope with the rising tide of insecurity, Brian turned to his old coping mechanism, chemical oblivion. The alcohol consumption, which had always been heavy, became industrial. He began to mix it with pills, stimulants to wake up, depressants to sleep, anything to alter the frequency of his brain waves. He wasn't partying in the traditional sense. He was self-medicating a profound existential panic. He could feel the entity he created, the Rolling Stones, growing into a monster that he could no longer control. The faster the band rose, the smaller Brian felt. By 1964, the dynamic had become toxic. The band was touring incessantly, trapped in vans and hotel rooms, a pressure cooker of ego and exhaustion. In this environment, Brian's isolation became physical. Mick and Keith shared rooms, shared jokes, shared the secret language of songwriters. Brian roomed alone or with roadies. He would sit in the front of the van, staring out the window, separated from the laughter in the back by a wall of silence. He was the leader who had no followers. He was the captain of a ship where the crew had mutinied but hadn't bothered to throw him overboard yet because they still needed him to steer through the storms of live performance. His cruelty intensified. If he couldn't control the band, he would control the women. His relationships became battlegrounds. He needed to dominate, to possess, to crush. He treated women as disposable objects, using them to prop up his fragile ego and then discarding them when they demanded anything in return. This was not just misogyny. It was a displacement of his professional impotence. Every time Mick and Keith rejected one of his musical ideas, Brian would take it out on the nearest person who couldn't fight back. He was becoming a man comprised entirely of sharp edges, cutting everyone who got close, ensuring that his isolation would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. This behavior was not a sudden anomaly. It was the darkening of a pre-existing pattern, fueled by a terrifying insecurity. In the early days, Brian's conquests were about validation, proving he was the most desirable man in the room. But as his creative authority in the Rolling Stones evaporated, his romantic interactions morphed into a proxy war. The bedroom became the only domain where he could still play the tyrant. He demanded absolute submission to compensate for the fact that he was being overruled in the recording studio. He would subject his partners to psychological torture, alternating between overwhelming charm and icy detachment, a technique designed to shatter their self-esteem just as he felt his own was being shattered by the Jagger-Richards songwriting monopoly. He isolated his girlfriends, cutting them off from their friends and families, creating a hermetically sealed world where his word was law and his mood swings dictated the weather. It was a vampiric dynamic. He fed on their distress to replenish the power he was losing to Mick Jagger. The more insignificant he felt standing in the background, shaking a tambourine, the more terrifying he became behind closed doors. He was punishing these women for the success of a band that was leaving him behind. As the fame of the Rolling Stones exploded across America in 1964 and 1965, the tragedy of Brian Jones entered its second act. He was the golden boy of the British invasion, the face of the fashion revolution, the icon of cool. But inside the bubble, he was rotting. He was a man who had climbed to the top of the mountain only to realize he had brought the wrong equipment. He had built a machine designed to play the blues, and it had been repurposed to print money. He was rich, he was famous, and he was completely, utterly redundant. And in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike, was the ultimate betrayal that would finally break his spirit. The loss of the only thing he had left that was truly his. To the outside observer, Brian was the epitome of the rock star dream. He was the one the cameras loved most, with his perfect blonde bob, his heavy-lidded eyes, and his sartorial flair. He defined the aesthetic of the swingin' 60s. He was the prototype for every rock and roll frontman who would follow. Yet he wasn't the frontman. This paradox ate him alive. He was trapped in a golden cage of his own making. He was being worshipped by millions of screaming teenagers for playing pop songs he secretly despised. Every concert was a reminder of his compromise. Every royalty check was a reminder of his sellout. He had wanted to be a blues purist, a respected musician like Elmore James, but he had become a pinup, a mannequin dressed in velvet. The disconnect between his public image as the leader and his private reality as an employee was a psychological fracture that widened with every tour date. He drowned this cognitive dissonance in an ocean of alcohol and pharmaceuticals. But the drugs didn't numb the pain. They only amplified the paranoia. He began to suspect everyone of conspiring against him, unaware that his own erratic behavior was the very thing driving his allies away. He was technically on stage, but functionally obsolete. He stood in the spotlight, but the microphone belonged to Mick. The arrival of Anita Pallenberg in 1965 was not a romantic development. It was the introduction of a high-grade accelerant into an already burning building. If Brian Jones was the architect of the band's image, Anita was the final, lethal, aesthetic touch he had been searching for. She was German-Italian, sophisticated, multilingual, and possessed a dangerous, feral charisma that eclipsed even the rock stars she associated with. When Brian met her, he didn't just see a lover, he saw a mirror. She was the female version of himself, narcissistic, stylish, and chemically adventurous. Acquiring her was his way of reasserting the dominance that was slipping away in the recording studio. By having the most desirable woman in London on his arm, Brian could still look down at Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. It was a status play, but in bringing her into the inner circle, Brian inadvertently introduced the instrument of his own final psychological dismantling. Anita was not a passive victim like the teenage girls Brian had previously discarded. She was a force of nature, a woman of immense will and intellect, who terrified and fascinated the other Stones. She brought a darker, more European edge to the band's circle. She taught Brian how to dress in the flamboyant, gender-bending style that would define the era, but she also introduced a level of intensity that his fragile psyche could not handle. They were the golden couple of London, a breathtakingly beautiful disaster. They looked like siblings, dressed alike, bleached their hair alike, and consumed the world alike. But beneath the glamour of the photo shoots lay a contest of wills that Brian was destined to lose. He wanted a possession. He found a predator. He wanted someone to reflect his glory. Instead, he found someone who exposed his weakness. Anita was stronger than him, smarter than him, and ultimately more ruthless than him. She saw through the facade of the rock star to the scared little boy from Cheltenham beneath, and that visibility was intolerable to a narcissist like Brian. The relationship between Brian and Anita was a spectacle of dysfunction. It was a closed loop of paranoia, drug abuse, and violence. Their apartment became a gothic theater of cruelty. Brian, fueled by a cocktail of alcohol and paranoia, began to view Anita as a possession that was constantly at risk of being stolen. His insecurity manifested as rage. He beat her. These were not minor altercations. They were brutal, physical assaults. He broke his hand, punching her in the face, a fracture that forced him to miss gigs, damaging the band's revenue stream. This was the moment the personal pathology began to infect the professional operation. The band could tolerate Brian being difficult. They could not tolerate him being absent because he had injured himself, assaulting his girlfriend. To Keith Richards, who watched this from a close distance, the violence was repulsive. It created a moral justification for what was about to happen, a way to frame a betrayal as a rescue mission. The collapse of Brian's personal empire occurred on the road to Morocco in early 1967. The trip was intended to be a psychedelic pilgrimage, a journey into the heart of the counterculture. Instead, it became a funeral procession for Brian's ego. Brian, Anita, and Keith Richards embarked on the journey in Brian's Bentley. The atmosphere in the car was toxic. Brian was in a state of drug-induced psychosis, oscillating between weeping fits and violent outbursts. He was physically present but mentally disintegrating. When the strain became too much and Brian was hospitalized in France for a respiratory panic attack, exacerbated by drug use, Keith and Anita made their move. They left him. They didn't just leave him in the hospital, they left him in the past. Keith Richards drove Anita to Morocco, initiating a sexual and romantic relationship that would last for more than a decade. When Brian finally arrived in Marrakesh, staggering into the hotel lobby, he found the couple together. The betrayal was absolute. It was a total usurpation. Keith Richards had not only taken the musical reins of the band, he had now taken Brian's woman, his muse and his symbol of cool. The psychological castration was complete. Brian Jones never recovered from this event. He did not fight for her. He collapsed. He accepted the humiliation with a frightening passivity, a sign that his will to live was already fracturing. From 1967 onwards, Brian was no longer a rival to Mick and Keith. He was their victim, a defeated man who was forced to stand on stage next to the man who stole his life. This personal devastation coincided with a frantic, desperate attempt to remain musically relevant. As the Jagger Richards songwriting machine became the sole source of the band's material, Brian was forced to reinvent his role. He could no longer dictate the structure of the songs, so he became the decorator. He became a texture artist. This period ironically produced some of his most brilliant and haunting work, but it was the brilliance of a man shouting from the edge of a cliff. On Paint It Black, finding the standard guitar parts boring, he sat on the floor with a sitar. He didn't play it like an Indian classical musician. He played it like a blues guitarist, creating the menacing, droning riff that defined the song. On Under My Thumb, a song whose lyrics about controlling a woman were painfully ironic given his own situation, he played the marimba, adding a ghostly, hollow melodic line that gave the track its sinister atmosphere. On Ruby Tuesday, he played the recorder. He was picking up any instrument he could find, mellotrons, dulcimers, auto harps, desperate to add something, anything that Mick and Keith couldn't do. He was proving his utility. "Look at me," the instrument screamed. "I am still the genius." But these contributions, however iconic, were ornamental. He was applying wallpaper to a house he was no longer allowed to build. Mick and Keith accepted these contributions, but they viewed them as novelties, not structural necessities. They were indulging him. While Brian was fighting a losing war inside the band, the British establishment decided to open a second front against him. In 1967, the News of the World and the police force launched a concerted effort to crush the Rolling Stones. They were seen as a threat to the moral order of the nation. The British establishment needed a head to put on a pike, and Brian volunteered his own. While Mick Jagger and Keith Richards insulated themselves with high-priced legal teams and locked gates, Brian practically left the front door open. He was too naive to hide his habits and too drugged to fight back. The judicial system needed a sacrificial lamb, and Brian was the perfect offering. He lived openly, recklessly, and without protection. On May 10, 1967, the police raided Brian's flat in Courtfield Road. It was a surgical strike. They found cannabis, cocaine, and methamphetamine. Brian was arrested, dragged out in front of the press, a broken figure in a velvet coat. The arrest shattered his remaining composure. The fear of prison was not just a worry about confinement. It was a terror of physical reality. Brian was frail. He was paranoid. He knew he would not survive in a cell. The legal battles that followed drained his finances and his energy. He was subjected to psychiatric evaluations that laid bare his crumbling psyche. The doctors described a man with severe personality disorders, a polite medical term for a soul that was being eaten alive by anxiety and narcissism. While the world celebrated the Summer of Love in 1967, Brian Jones was hitting rock bottom. The band released their Satanic Majesty's Request, a chaotic attempt to mimic the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper. Brian was heavily involved, playing the mellotron and weaving dense psychedelic textures, but the album was a critical failure. The band blamed the lack of direction. Mick and Keith decided that the experiment was over. They needed to go back to rock and roll. They needed to go back to the blues. This decision, seemingly a return to Brian's roots, was actually his death warrant. When the band entered the studio in 1968 to record Beggar's Banquet, the dynamic had shifted from dismissal to open hostility. They were returning to the raw, guitar-driven sound that Brian had originally championed, but they no longer trusted him to play it. His reliability had flatlined. He would disappear for days. When he did arrive, he was often a zombie, his eyes glazed with mandrax, his speech slurred. He was a disruption to the workflow. The industrial nature of the recording process, time is money, efficiency is key, had no place for an erratic junkie, even if he was the founder. The stories from these sessions are harrowing in their cruelty. Brian would set up his amplifier, eager to play slide guitar on a track like No Expectations. He would play, eyes closed, lost in the music, believing he was bonding with his bandmates again. In the control room, Keith Richards would turn to the engineer, Jimmy Miller, and say, "Turn him off." They would cut the signal. Brian would continue to play, hearing the sound in his own head while the tape captured nothing. He was pantomiming membership in the band. Sometimes they wouldn't even tell him when the sessions were. He would find out later that they had recorded Sympathy for the Devil or Street Fighting Man without him. He was being ghosted by the people he saw every day. The isolation was total. He bought Cotchford Farm in November 1968, seeking a retreat. He talked about forming a new band. He jammed with Jimi Hendrix and John Lennon, desperate to find peers who respected him. But these were fleeting moments. The reality was the solitude of the Sussex countryside, the bottle of vodka, and the growing realization that the Rolling Stones were preparing to tour America, a tour he knew he could not join. His drug convictions had made him a persona non grata in the United States. No visa meant no tour meant no money. He was a blockage in the pipe. By the spring of 1969, Brian Jones was physically unrecognizable. The golden-haired archangel of 1964 was gone. In his place was a bloated, puffy man with dark circles under his eyes and a vacant stare. His liver was failing. His heart was enlarging. The asthma that had plagued his childhood returned with a vengeance, exacerbated by the smoke and the stress. He was 27 years old, but his biological age was closer to 60. He was physically disintegrating, stuck on the periphery of the massive corporation he had created, waiting for the inevitable collision. The final months of his life were defined by the presence of Frank Thorogood. Thorogood was not a musician, he was a builder. He represented the reality of the working class that Brian had tried to escape, yet now Brian was dependent on him. Thorogood moved into Cotchford Farm ostensibly to supervise renovations, but in reality, he became Brian's keeper. The power dynamic in the house was a grotesque parody of Brian's life. Brian was the master, paying the bills, but he was physically weak and constantly intoxicated. Thorogood was the servant, but he was physically strong and sober enough to manipulate the situation. He controlled the access to the house. He controlled the flow of money. He became the gatekeeper to a fallen king. The tension at Cotchford Farm grew as the summer heat intensified. The renovations were a disaster. Beams were rotting, the roof leaked, the bills were astronomical. Brian, in moments of clarity, realized he was being swindled. He would scream at Thorogood, threatening to fire him, threatening to cut off the cash flow. But then the fog of alcohol would descend, and Brian would be the vulnerable child again, needing Thorogood to drive him to the station, to fetch his pills, to keep the world at bay. It was a dance of mutual destruction. Then came the knock on the door on June 8, 1969. The final board meeting. Mick, Keith, and Charlie did not come to kill him. They came to sign the divorce papers. They found a man who was already halfway to the grave. Brian did not fight them. He didn't smash a guitar or throw a drink. He simply nodded. He asked with a heartbreaking naivety if he could still keep the name the Rolling Stones for himself if they formed a new band. They said no. The name was the brand, and the brand belonged to the shareholders. Brian Jones was no longer a shareholder. He watched them drive away down the long driveway of Cotchford Farm, taking his life's work with them. He was left with his demons, his pills, and Frank Thorogood. The structure had collapsed. All that was left was the debris. And in the debris, the final sequence of events began to click into place, leading inexorably to the heated pool and the silence of July 2nd. The weeks following the excommunication were a period of deceptive tranquility, a phantom summer where Brian Jones appeared to be recovering but was, in reality, entering the terminal phase of his existence. The immediate reaction to being fired was not the catastrophic collapse that Mick and Keith had anticipated. Instead, Brian exhibited a strange, manic lightness. He told friends that a weight had been lifted. The crushing pressure of having to compete with the Jagger, Richard's machine, was gone. He was no longer the redundant limb of a giant organism. He was a free agent again. He spoke excitedly about forming a new supergroup. He reached out to John Lennon. He listened obsessively to Creedence Clearwater Revival, talking about getting back to American roots music. He even demoed a few tracks, rough sketches of a sound that was earthy and acoustic. For a fleeting moment, it seemed possible that Brian Jones might survive the wreckage of his own creation. But this optimism was a mirage generated by the sudden release of tension. The structural damage to his psyche was too deep to be repaired by a few weeks of freedom. Without the rigid schedule of the band, the recording sessions, the photo shoots, the tours, Brian lost the scaffolding that held his chaotic life together. He was a man who defined himself entirely by his fame, and now he was exiled in Sussex, surrounded by people who were paid to be there. The court at Cotchford Farm was a grim parody of the social scene he once commanded. Instead of peers like Bob Dylan or Jimi Hendrix, his circle had shrunk to his girlfriend, Anna Wolin, a few loyal but exhausted assistants, and the looming silent presence of Frank Thorogood. Cotchford Farm itself played a character in this final act. It was a house steeped in a specific kind of English melancholy. A. Milne had written the Winnie the Pooh stories there, and the ghost of Christopher Robin seemed to hang in the damp air. The garden was littered with statues from the Winnie the Pooh stories, a childish backdrop for the grim reality unfolding inside the house. Brian was obsessed with the house's history, but he was also terrified of it. He felt the place was haunted. He told friends he could feel a malevolent presence. In reality, the malevolence was terrestrial. It was the growing friction between the master of the house and the man hired to fix it. The relationship between Brian Jones and Frank Thorogood in June 1969 is the key to unlocking the mystery of the pool. It was a classic study in class resentment and power imbalance. Brian was the frail, effeminate aristocrat of rock, possessing wealth he hadn't earned through manual labor, treating the world with haughty disdain. Thorogood was the bricklayer, the man of muscle and sweat, who viewed Brian with a mixture of envy and contempt. Thorogood saw a weak man living in luxury, a man who couldn't change a light bulb but could command thousands of pounds. Brian, in turn, saw Thorogood as a necessary utility, a rough-hewn protector who could be ordered around. But the dynamic had inverted. Brian was physically deteriorating. His liver was swollen, his asthma was constant, and his coordination was shot. He relied on Thorogood for everything. Thorogood drove him. Thorogood brought him food. Thorogood managed the visitors. The servant had become the warden, and the warden was stealing from the prisoner. Brian began to notice discrepancies in the bills. Thorogood exploited Brian's dependency to catastrophic levels. While the renovation work stalled, the financial demands escalated aggressively. Brian, usually careless with money, finally realized the servant was looting the master. The tension simmered throughout the hot days of late June. Brian would drink wine in the morning, vodka in the afternoon, and brandy at night. In his intoxicated state, his politeness vanished. He would berate Thorogood in front of the others. He would mock his work. He would threaten to cut off the payments. "I'm not paying for this rubbish, Frank," he would slur, waving a hand at a half-finished wall. Thorogood would take it, his face tightening, swallowing the insults because the golden goose was still laying eggs. But every insult was a deposit in a bank of rage that was nearing capacity. It It was a dangerous game, a physically defenseless man provoking a physically powerful one in an isolated house miles from help. July 2nd, 1969, dawned with a heavy, oppressive heat. It was the kind of weather that makes the air feel solid, amplifying irritability and lethargy. The timeline of this day has been reconstructed from the fragmented and often contradictory testimonies of the four people present: Brian Jones, his girlfriend Anna Woline, Frank Thorogood, and Janet Lawson, a nurse who was a friend of Thorogood's. The day began slowly. Brian was in a relatively good mood, though he was already drinking. The heat made the pool the center of gravity. The water was heated to over 80 degrees Fahrenheit, a warm bath in the middle of a hot day, a detail that would later be crucial physiologically. Warm water lowers blood pressure, alcohol dilates blood vessels. The combination creates a recipe for fainting or vagal inhibition. But Brian wasn't thinking about physiology. He was thinking about relief. Throughout the afternoon, the group drifted between the house and the garden. There was a deceptive normalcy to the scene. They sat on the grass. They listened to music. But underneath, the financial dispute was festering. Earlier in the day, or perhaps the day before, Brian had finally snapped. He told Thorogood that he was firing him. He told him the renovation work was finished. The gravy train was stopping. After the futile attempts at resuscitation, that the call was made, not to the police initially, but to the Rolling Stones' inner circle. The first instinct was not to save the man, but to manage the situation. The cleanup operation began before the body was even cold. The priority was to sanitize the scene, to hide the drugs, to align the stories. Brian Jones, the human being, was gone. Brian Jones, the PR problem, had just arrived. When the first police car rolled up the driveway of Cotchford Farm, the blue lights flashing against the trees of the 100-acre wood, the cover-up was already solidifying. The official narrative was being drafted in the minds of the survivors. It was an accident. It was an asthma attack. It was just a tragedy. Frank Thorogood dried his hands, composed his face, and prepared to play the role of the grieving friend. The architect was dead. The builder was the only witness. And the water in the pool settled back into a glassy, impenetrable surface, hiding the truth beneath its chlorine reflection. The arrival of the Sussex police at Cotchford Farm in the early hours of July 3rd, 1969, did not mark the beginning of a rigorous investigation. It marked the commencement of a procedural formality. The officers who stepped out of their patrol cars were local constables, accustomed to rural disputes and traffic accidents, not the murky high-stakes world of international rock stars. They were immediately outmaneuvered. The scene they encountered had already been stage-managed. The timeline had been blurred. The panic had been suppressed. The primary witnesses, Frank Thorogood, Anna Woline, and Janet Lawson, were isolated and terrified. But the narrative was already coalescing around the convenient theory of an asthma attack or a drunken accident. Crucially, the machinery of the Rolling Stones was already moving to protect its interests. The band's fixer and driver, Tom Keylock, arrived swiftly. Keylock was a man who operated in the gray zones, a problem solver who understood that the priority was not truth, but containment. His presence signaled that the death of Brian Jones was now a corporate event to be managed, not a human tragedy to be mourned. Keylock's role was not merely administrative, it was forensic elimination. While the police were being stalled, Keylock allegedly orchestrated the physical destruction of the timeline. Witnesses later described a bonfire in the garden of Cotchford Farm that night, fed not by wood, but by evidence. Keylock was accused of burning the clothes Brian had been wearing before entering the pool, along with Thorogood's wet clothing, incinerating the fabric that could have carried traces of a struggle. He didn't just manage the press, he sanitized the crime scene, ensuring that by the time the constables arrived, the reality of the murder had been reduced to ash and swept away. While Brian's body was being transported to the mortuary, a second, more grotesque violation was taking place inside the farmhouse. The looting began before the medical examiner had even made his first incision. It was a frenzy of extraction. The friends and employees who had lived off Brian's generosity instantly transformed into vultures. The house was stripped with industrial efficiency. Guitars, amplifiers, gold records, jewelry, and designer clothes, the tangible artifacts of his stardom, were carried out into the night. It was not merely theft, it was a liquidation of assets by the very people who had claimed to protect him. Frank Thorogood and his associates were reportedly seen loading items into vans. Even the tapes of Brian's recent musical experiments, the potential seeds of his solo career, vanished. The callousness of this act cannot be overstated. Brian Jones was not just dead, he was being erased. His physical legacy was being dismantled and fenced before his family had even been notified. The official autopsy, conducted by Dr. Albert Sachs, provided the legal cover necessary to close the file. The report was a catalog of physiological ruin. It noted that Brian's liver was fatty and degenerated, twice the normal weight, a testament to a decade of chronic alcoholism. His heart showed signs of fibrous degeneration. There were pleural adhesions in the lungs, scars from his lifelong battle with asthma. The toxicology report was damning, revealing a blood alcohol level of 145 milligrams per 100 milliliters, combined with amphetamines and a sleeping pill. But the report contained a critical anomaly that was glossed over in the rush to judgment. The lungs were not heavy with water. In a typical drowning, the victim inhales water in a desperate, spasmodic attempt to breathe, filling the lungs and weighing them down. Brian's lungs were relatively light. This suggested freshwater drowning, where water is absorbed quickly into the bloodstream, or, more disturbingly, a death caused by vagal inhibition, shock causing the heart to stop instantly upon immersion or under duress. And he wanted Thorogood and his crew off the property immediately. It was an eviction notice. For Thorogood, this wasn't just a loss of a job, it was a humiliation and a financial disaster. He had tens of thousands of pounds allegedly owed to him. He wasn't going to leave quietly. As evening approached, the alcohol consumption accelerated. Brian was drinking brandy. Thorogood was drinking vodka. The atmosphere shifted from lazy to jagged. The air in the farmhouse kitchen was thick with smoke and unspoken threats. Janet Lawson, the outsider in the group, later recalled feeling an intense vibrating tension. She sensed that something violent was coiling in the room. She tried to stay out of the way, retreating to the background, watching the two men circle each other. Around 10 p.m., Brian decided he wanted to swim. It was a compulsion. He wanted to wash off the heat and the stress. He invited the others. Anna Woline declined. She wanted to stay inside. Janet Lawson was hesitant, but Thorogood agreed. The two men walked out into the darkness of the garden. The pool lights were on, turning the water into a glowing blue rectangle, surrounded by the deep shadows of the statues and the trees. What happened next is the subject of 50 years of speculation, but the forensic psychology of the moment points to a specific trajectory. Brian and Thorogood were alone in the pool. The water was warm. Brian was heavily intoxicated. His blood alcohol level would later be measured at a staggering amount, equivalent to 3.5 pints of beer combined with a massive amount of spirits. In this state, his inhibitions were gone. He was likely taunting Thorogood again. He felt safe in the water. He was the swimmer. Thorogood was the builder. This was his element. The rock star floated on his back, staring up at the stars. His mind was blurry, but his tongue remained sharp. He mocks the man treading water beside him. He laughs about the money he won't pay. He asserts his dominance one last time. And Thorogood, the man of bricks and mortar, the man who has swallowed months of insults, finally reaches the breaking point. The exact events in the pool remain a subject of debate. What is certain is that Thorogood was the last person to see Jones alive. Janet Lawson, watching from the house or the patio, later gave conflicting accounts, terrified by the police and the implications. Anna Woline was inside, perhaps changing, perhaps resting. The window of opportunity for violence was narrow, 10, maybe 15 minutes. It did not require a premeditated murder plot. It required only a flash of rage, a hand on a head, a shove, a struggle that lasted seconds. A man with Brian's lung capacity and swimming ability does not drown silently without cause. He fights, unless he is held down, unless the accident is assisted. Decades later, allegations surfaced that Thorogood confessed to band associate Tom Keylock on his deathbed, though this claim remains unverified. Keylock claimed Thorogood added the visceral detail, "I crunched him." While this admission was never verified by police, for many, it stands as a confession of a lethal physical act, a smoking gun delivered with the last breath of the only other man in the pool. At roughly midnight, the silence of the garden was broken not by a scream, but by a frantic commotion. Frank Thorogood entered the house. He was wet. His demeanor was shaking. He did not call an ambulance. He did not scream for help immediately. He found Anna Woline. His words were odd, detached. He didn't say, "Brian is drowning." He said something to the effect of, "Something's happened to Brian," or "Brian's in trouble." Anna ran. She sprinted through the dark garden, her heart hammering against her ribs. When she reached the pool, the stillness was the first thing that hit her. The water was undisturbed. And there, at the deep end, resting on the bottom like a discarded statue, was Brian Jones. He was face down. He was motionless. The pool lights illuminated his golden hair, which floated around his head like a halo. The chaos that followed was a blur of incompetence and panic. They dragged him out. He was heavy. Dead weight is a literal term. They laid him on the concrete tiles. Anna, desperate, tried to perform CPR. She was convinced she felt a pulse. She was convinced his hand gripped hers. But this was likely the phantom hope of grief. Thorogood stood by, watching. He didn't help. He was smoking a cigarette, trembling, his eyes wide with the realization of what had just occurred. Janet Lawson, the nurse, knew instantly. She looked at the color of his skin, the cyanosis, the blue-gray tint of oxygen deprivation. She looked at the lack of chest movement. She knew the engine had stopped, but they went through the motions. They pumped his chest. They breathed into his mouth. They were trying to restart a machine that had been smashed. It was only then the coroner, Dr. Angus Somerville, did not dwell on these inconsistencies. He delivered the verdict that everyone wanted: death by misadventure. It was a tidy bureaucratic label that absolved everyone of responsibility. It blamed the victim. Brian Jones died because he was Brian Jones, a drunk asthmatic rock star who made a mistake. Case closed. But the pathology of Brian Jones extended far beyond his physical remains. To portray him solely as a victim is to ignore the toxic wreckage he left in his wake. The tragic irony was that the isolation he died in was largely self-inflicted. The cruel abandonment of his own children and the brutal violence he unleashed on partners, like Anita Pallenberg, were not just side effects of stardom. They were symptoms of a profound lack of empathy. He demanded absolute loyalty from his bandmates while offering none to his own flesh and blood. When the music could no longer sustain his ego, he turned to shock tactics. The infamous 1966 photo shoot, where he posed in a full Nazi SS uniform, standing over a mutilated doll, was not art, and it certainly wasn't satire. It was pathology. It was the visual evidence of a rotting mind, a desperate attempt to provoke hatred just to feel seen. It was the behavior of a man whose moral compass had completely demagnetized, screaming for attention in the most repulsive way possible. He was a musical genius, yes, but one who systematically dismantled his own support systems until there was no one left to pull him from the water. Thus, the man who lay dead in the Sussex morgue was a paradox. He was a musical genius who could coax weeping beauty out of a slide guitar, a visionary who heard the future of rock and roll before anyone else. But beneath the velvet coat lay a tormented soul who had systematically alienated everyone who ever loved him. The tragedy of his death is compounded by the tragedy of his life. He possessed the talent to build a kingdom, but lacked the character to rule it. As the news of his death radiated out from Cotchford Farm to London and then to the world, the reaction of his former bandmates revealed the final cold truth of his existence. To the Rolling Stones, Brian Jones had ceased to be a person long before he stopped breathing. He had become an inconvenience, and now in death he was about to become something even more cynical, a marketing opportunity. The funeral of Brian Jones on July 10th, 1969 in Cheltenham was the final confirmation of his absolute isolation. It was a ceremony defined not by who was present, but by who was absent. The Rolling Stones, the entity Brian had summoned into existence from the dust of post-war London, effectively boycotted the burial of their founder. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were not there. They claimed they were contractually bound to recording commitments in Australia, a convenient corporate excuse that fooled no one. Anita Pallenberg, the woman who had been the center of the psychodrama between Brian and Keith, also stayed away. The only members of the band who attended were Charlie Watts and Bill Wyman, the rhythm section, the quiet workmen of the group, who perhaps retained a shred of human decency amidst the ruthless ambition of the frontmen. They stood by the grave in the Priory Road Cemetery, looking uncomfortable in their suits, witnessing the final interment of the man who had once been their leader. The band paid for the casket, a lavish bronze structure reportedly flown in from America, and sent a floral arrangement shaped like the gates of heaven. It was a gesture of expensive guilt, a financial transaction to cover a moral deficit. As the dirt hit the metal, the message was clear. Brian Jones was now history, and the Rolling Stones were a business that could not be paused for grief. Just 5 days prior to the funeral, the band had performed the ultimate act of image rehabilitation in Hyde Park. The free concert on July 5, 1969 had been planned weeks in advance as the introduction of Mick Taylor, Brian's replacement. Following Brian's death, the band simply rebranded the event as a tribute. It was a masterstroke of public relations, turning a potentially career-damaging tragedy into a moment of collective mourning and spectacle. Mick Jagger walked onto the stage wearing a white dress, looking like a pre-Raphaelite angel, and read poetry by Percy Bysshe Shelley. He recited Adonais, an elegy for John Keats, speaking of a soul that outsoared the shadow of our night. It was a performance of breathtaking cynicism. The man who had fired Brian, who had marginalized him, and who was now actively erasing his musical contributions, was posing as his chief mourner. The hypocrisy was theatrical. The climax of the Hyde Park concert provided a grim, unintentional metaphor for Brian's life. Thousands of cabbage-white butterflies were released from boxes on the stage. They were meant to fly up into the summer sky, a symbol of Brian's spirit ascending. but the butterfly had been kept in the boxes too long in the stifling heat. They were dehydrated. They were weak. Instead of soaring, many of them simply fell to the stage, dead or dying, trampled under the feet of the roadies and the musicians. It was a grotesque mirror of reality, fragile creatures crushed by the machinery of the show. The concert was not a wake, it was a coronation for the new lineup. Mick Taylor played well. The band sounded tighter, heavier, more efficient, without Brian's erratic presence. The crowd cheered. The machine rolled on. Brian Jones had been processed, packaged as a tragedy, and consumed as entertainment. In the decades that followed, the 27 Club became a cultural phenomenon, with Brian Jones retroactively appointed as its founding chairman. But this categorization is a disservice to the specific brutality of his end. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison, who would all follow him into the grave within 2 years, died primarily from the direct overdose of their own excesses. Brian Jones died from exclusion. His death was the result of a systematic dismantling of his identity. He was not a burnout. He was a cast-out. The industrial accident was not just the drowning. It was the years of psychological grinding that rendered him too weak to swim. The forensic analysis of his legacy reveals that while the Jagger-Richards partnership built the walls and the roof of the Rolling Stones, Brian Jones poured the concrete foundation. It is impossible to listen to the band's golden era without hearing his fingerprints, even if he didn't write the songs. The menacing, droning sitar on Paint It Black is Brian. The baroque, ghostly recorder on Ruby Tuesday is Brian. The icy, hollow marimba on Under My Thumb is Brian. He was the texture, the color, and the experimental edge that saved the band from being just another Chuck Berry cover act. He brought the danger. He brought the androgyny. He was the one who understood that rock and roll was not just about the notes you played, but the aura you projected. When he died, the Rolling Stones became a tighter rock band, a more profitable corporation, and a massive stadium act. But they never again possessed the dangerous, avant-garde mystique that Brian Jones carried in his velvet pockets. They traded magic for efficiency. The mystery of the pool remains a cold case in the files of history, but the moral verdict is clear. Whether Frank Thorogood held him down in a fit of rage, or whether Brian simply slipped under the water while his friends watched, the outcome was the same. He was surrounded by people who viewed him as a commodity, a paycheck, or a nuisance. He died in a house filled with strangers, while the brothers he chose, Mick and Keith, were conquering the world he promised them. Brian Jones was the architect who designed a castle so magnificent that his own creation evicted him. He stands as a cautionary monument to the brutality of the music industry, a reminder that talent is no defense against the organizational ruthlessness of a billion-dollar enterprise. He lies in Cheltenham, under a headstone paid for by the corporation, his bones turning to dust, while the name he chose, the Rolling Stones, continues to generate millions. The silence at the bottom of the pool was not peace. It was the sound of a man being erased. And in the end, the water settled, the ripples vanished, and the Rolling Stones kept rolling, leaving their creator behind in the deep end. Brian Jones remains a tragic figure in rock history, a musical pioneer who built a legacy that ultimately outgrew him. The silence at Cotchford Farm may be permanent, but the conversation about these forgotten legacies doesn't have to end here. Who else in history has been overshadowed by their own creation? We invite you to share your thoughts and suggestions for future documentaries. Your support through liking and subscribing is what allows us to continue giving a voice to those who were silenced. Until next time.